They say a man can work his fingers down to stubs, sweat till his clothes are salt-stained and stiff, push his body past the limits of what's reasonable, all for a flicker of something better. They say he can be the most dependable soul in 3 counties, the one folks call when everything else has failed, the kind of man whose word is steel and whose effort is boundless. And yet, for all that effort, for all that grit, he can still find himself staring at an empty wallet, wondering where all the years went, how all that hard work managed to slip through his grasp like water. It's a cruel kind of magic, that trick, the one where the harder you row, the further you seem to drift from shore. There's a quiet desperation in that, a particular kind of exhaustion that settles not just in the bones, but deep in the soul where hope used to sit. Bo was such a man. 42 years old, though the lines etched around his eyes and the permanent grease stains under his fingernails often suggested a decade more. He was a mechanic, through and through, the kind with hands that told stories without a single word. They were broad and calloused, scarred in places by hot metal and slipping wrenches, strong enough to twist off the tightest bolt, yet surprisingly nimble when coaxing a tiny wire back into place. His movements were economical, precise, born of years spent under the hood, navigating the labyrinthine guts of engines that others had given up for dead. He wasn't much for small talk, Bo. Preferred the hum of a well-tuned engine to the clatter of idle chatter, the honest language of failing parts to the often hollow promises of men. When he did speak, his voice was a low rumble, direct and to the point, leaving no room for misunderstanding. But if you watched him, really watched him, you'd see a quiet fire burning behind his steady gaze. His eyes, the color of a cloudy autumn sky, were perpetually observant, missing nothing. They held a spark of hidden resolve, yes, but also a deep-seated weariness, a fatigue that seemed to have burrowed past the muscle and bone, right into the marrow. It was the weariness of a man who carried the weight of more than just a busted transmission, the weight of a silent, relentless battle he fought every single day. He moved with a practiced grace that belied the aches surely residing in his back and knees, a kind of stoic endurance that earned him the quiet respect of the folks who brought their rattling, sputtering lives to his garage. You could tell, just by looking at him, that Bo didn't waste a single motion or a single word, because time, for him, was a currency far more precious than silver or gold. Every minute counted, every repair meant something. He was reliable, yes, dependable to a fault, but beneath that calm, almost gruff exterior lay the coiled spring of a man constantly fighting to keep his head above water, one wrench turn at a time. They say a man can work his fingers down to stubs, sweat till his clothes are salt-stained and stiff, push his body past the limits of what's reasonable, all for a flicker of something better. They say he can be the most dependable soul in 3 counties, the one folks call when everything else has failed, the kind of man whose word is steel and whose effort is boundless. And yet, for all that effort, for all that grit, he can still find himself staring at an empty wallet, wondering where all the years went, how all that hard work managed to slip through his grasp like water. It's a cruel kind of magic, that trick, the one where the harder you row, the further you seem to drift from shore. There's a quiet desperation in that, a particular kind of exhaustion that settles not just in the bones, but deep in the soul, where hope used to sit. Bo was such a man. 42 years old, though the lines etched around his eyes and the permanent grease stains under his fingernails often suggested a decade more. He was a mechanic, through and through, the kind with hands that told stories without a single word. They were broad and calloused, scarred in places by hot metal and slipping wrenches, strong enough to twist off the tightest bolt, yet surprisingly nimble when coaxing a tiny wire back into place. His movements were economical, precise, born of years spent under the hood, navigating the labyrinthine guts of engines that others had given up for dead. He wasn't much for small talk, Bo. Preferred the hum of a well-tuned engine to the clatter of idle chatter, the honest language of failing parts to the often hollow promises of men. When he did speak, his voice was a low rumble, direct and to the point, leaving no room for misunderstanding. But if you watched him, really watched him, you'd see a quiet fire burning behind his steady gaze. His eyes, the color of a cloudy autumn sky, were perpetually observant, missing nothing. They held a spark of hidden resolve, yes, but also a deep-seated weariness, a fatigue that seemed to have burrowed past the muscle and bone, right into the marrow. It was the weariness of a man who carried the weight of more than just a busted transmission, the weight of a silent, relentless battle he fought every single day. He moved with a practiced grace that belied the aches surely residing in his back and knees, a kind of stoic endurance that earned him the quiet respect of the folks who brought their rattling, sputtering lives to his garage. You could tell, just by looking at him, that Bo didn't waste a single motion or a single word, because time, for him, was a currency far more precious than silver or gold. Every minute counted, every repair meant something. He was reliable, yes, dependable to a fault, but beneath that calm, almost gruff exterior lay the coiled spring of a man constantly fighting to keep his head above water, one wrench turn at a time. Every morning began the same. The quiet groan of a 5 a.m. alarm, a mechanical sigh in the pre-dawn stillness. Bo would rise not with a jolt, but with a slow, deliberate unfolding, like a stiff old tarp being unrolled. The floorboards in their little rental house would creak beneath his weight, a familiar protest. A quick splash of cold water on his face, the taste of instant coffee, bitter, scalding, and necessary. He'd stand for a moment at the bedroom door, watching Sarah sleep, her breathing soft, and even a silent prayer for her peace, for the brief reprieve from the grind. Then a quiet kiss on Lily's forehead, then Ethan's, smelling of sleep and childhood before he slipped out, the tools in the back of his pickup clinking a metallic rhythm as he navigated the dark, potholed streets. His garage, tucked away on the industrial edge of town, was his second home, a sanctuary of ordered chaos. The air inside always smelled of oil, gasoline, and the metallic tang of hot metal, a scent that was as familiar and comforting to him as the brewing coffee was to other men. Day in, day out, it was the same ballet of breakdown and repair. A seized engine, a sputtering carburetor, a shredded belt, the endless parade of vehicles, each one a puzzle, each one a challenge he was uniquely skilled to solve. He'd bend over an engine block, his calloused fingers tracing the lines of a fuel injector, his eyes scanning for the telltale signs of trouble, his mind already mapping out the solution. He worked with a quiet intensity, a focused calm that was almost meditative, the world outside fading to a dull hum. But even as his hands performed their intricate dance of wrenches and ratchets, his mind was rarely still. It was a constant calculator, tabulating the hours, the parts, the meager profit margins. Every job was a race against the clock, against the mounting pile of bills that lay waiting on the kitchen counter at home. Rent was due again. Lily needed new shoes. Ethan's school trip. The utility bill from last month felt like a punch to the gut. No matter how many hours he put in, no matter how many engines he brought back from the brink, the financial treadmill just spun faster, always a step or two ahead. He often felt like he was running in place, his legs burning, his lungs aching, but the finish line always seemed to recede into the distance. His small house, a perpetual clutter of half-finished projects and children's toys, often mirrored the chaos in his bank account. Tools often spilled from his garage onto the driveway, a physical manifestation of his life seeping out beyond its intended boundaries, too much to contain. Beneath the steady hands and observant eyes of Bo, a deeper current churned. It wasn't just the present struggles that haunted him. It was the ghosts of a past he desperately wanted to outrun. His own childhood had been marked by instability, by the constant gnawing fear of not enough. He remembered the quiet despair in his mother's eyes, the forced smiles when the cupboards were bare. That fear, cold and insidious, had burrowed deep within him, taking root. He carried it like a phantom ache, a constant reminder of what could happen if he ever let his guard down. He was a master of his trade, yes, revered for his ability to fix anything with an engine, but the irony wasn't lost on him. He could fix broken machines, but his own life, for all his tireless effort, felt perpetually out of tune, perpetually on the verge of breaking down. He saw other men he considered less skilled, less dedicated, somehow pulling ahead, buying new trucks, taking their families on vacations. A quiet, fierce ambition burned within him, not for flashy cars or big houses, but for something far more fundamental: security. He yearned for a foundation beneath his family's feet that wouldn't shift or crumble. He wanted to look at Sarah without seeing the subtle lines of worry etched around her eyes. He wanted to see Lily and Ethan laugh without the silent, nagging question of whether he could truly provide them with everything they needed, everything they deserved. He was a methodical problem solver by nature, applying a meticulous process to every engine fault, every complex repair. Yet, when it came to his own life, his own finances, he was still just reacting, still just chasing, still just fighting fires instead of building a shelter. He wanted more than to just survive. He wanted to live without that ever-present knot of anxiety in his gut. He was a man drowning in labor, a master craftsman trapped in a cycle of immediate cash for immediate needs, unable to lift his head long enough to see the wider horizon. The gap between the man he was, a tireless, skilled mechanic, and the man he desperately wanted to be, secure, stable, free from the financial dread, felt vast, a chasm he hadn't yet found a way to bridge. The 5 a.m. alarm was less a sound and more a physical jolt to Beau's ribs, a rude awakening that had become the rhythmic beat of his existence. He'd learned to move in the dark, the quiet hum of the old refrigerator the only other sound besides his own breath. Coffee, strong and black, brewed automatically, filling the small, cluttered rental house with its bitter aroma. He'd stand by the window, watching the streetlights cut through the lingering night, the world still asleep while his day had already begun. The sky outside was still just a smudge of indigo, promising another day, another grind. His lunchbox, packed with Sarah's careful hand, a sandwich, an apple, maybe a leftover piece of chicken, was always waiting by the door. He'd clatter quietly out, his worn boots heavy on the porch steps, past the tools that sometimes spilled from the garage onto the driveway, a permanent testament to the overflow of his work. The old pickup truck would grumble to life, protesting the cold, much like Beau himself. The garage was his second home, a sanctuary of sorts, but also a prison. The smell of oil, gasoline, and hot metal was as familiar as his own skin. He'd flip on the fluorescent lights, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across the bays, illuminating the waiting metal beasts, transmissions needing rebuilding, engines coughing their last, brakes screaming for attention. His hands, calloused and permanently stained with grease, moved with an practiced efficiency that was almost balletic. He could diagnose a failing manifold just by the sound, tell a story about a car's past life simply by the wear on its tires. He was a master of his craft, no doubt. Every bolt, every wrench, every turn of the screwdriver was precise, methodical. But precision in his work didn't translate to precision in his life. Each job was a singular battle, fought and won only to be replaced by another and another. The phone rang constantly, a symphony of demand. He'd quote prices, order parts, wrestle with stubborn lug nuts all day long. The air compressor hissed, the impact wrench screamed, the radio in the corner played classic rock that barely cut through the din. He was always on his feet, always moving, always doing. But at the end of the long, exhausting day, after the last car rolled out and he locked up the garage, the quiet drive home felt less like freedom and more like a brief respite before the whole cycle began again. He'd walk through his front door, the scent of whatever Sarah had cooked for dinner a fleeting comfort. Lily, with her bright, inquisitive eyes, and Ethan, a whirlwind of boundless energy, would greet him with hugs that momentarily erased the ache in his shoulders. He'd listen to their stories, nodding, trying to be present, but the drone of the day's work still echoed in his head, and the unseen stack of bills still sat heavy in his gut. Money, or the lack of it, was the constant shadow. Every invoice he wrote, every payment he received, felt like a temporary reprieve, never a true solution. The rent was always due. Utilities always climbed. The grocery bill, the ever-present car insurance, the kids' school supplies, the worn-out sneakers Ethan kept outgrowing. He'd stare at the bank statement, the numbers never quite adding up, always teetering on the edge. He was making money, good money by some standards, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. He poured in his labor, his skill, his very essence, and it just drained away. The dreams he once harbored had been buried so deep under layers of responsibility and exhaustion, he sometimes forgot what they even looked like. There was a time he'd thought about expanding, hiring a second hand, maybe even building his own shop. But those were flights of fancy now, luxuries he couldn't afford to entertain when the next bill was always looming. He longed for stability, for a life where he didn't have to calculate every penny, where a small, unexpected expense didn't send a shiver of panic down his spine. He yearned to simply be with his family, to take Sarah on a real date, to take the kids to the beach without checking his watch, calculating lost wages. He wanted to feel the solid ground beneath his feet, to know that if he took a day off, the whole house wouldn't come crashing down. That quiet, fierce ambition, that yearning for security, was constantly at war with the crushing reality of his daily grind, leaving him adrift in a sea of his own making, a master craftsman trapped in a treadmill of perpetual motion. That quiet, fierce ambition, that yearning for security, was constantly at war with the crushing reality of his daily grind, leaving him adrift in a sea of his own making, a master craftsman trapped in a treadmill of perpetual motion. Then one Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was Sarah, her voice thin and reedy, a sound Bo had only ever heard from her when things were truly bad. Lily, their 10-year-old, had collapsed at school. An ambulance already on its way to the emergency room. Bo's stomach dropped faster than a stripped bolt. He barely remembered hanging up, just grabbing his keys and heading out, leaving a half-finished transmission suspended on the hoist. The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room hummed with a sterile indifference that grated on his nerves. Every minute stretched, a rubber band pulled taut, threatening to snap. When the doctor finally emerged, a young man with tired eyes and a practiced, gentle tone, his words were a blur of medical terms and grave expressions. Appendicitis. Burst. Emergency surgery critical. Bo could feel the blood draining from his face, a cold sweat beating on his forehead. Sarah was already tear-stricken, clutching his arm so tight he could feel her nails digging in. The surgery was a success, thank God. But the recovery was long, complicated. Then came the bills. They piled up, stark white envelopes arriving daily, each one a fresh punch to the gut. The insurance, that meager policy they'd always just barely afforded, covered a fraction, a pitiful fraction. Bo sat at the kitchen table late one night, a small stack of papers under the dim glow of the overhead light, a calculator his only companion. The numbers danced before his eyes, spiraling higher and higher, a mocking tally of their misfortune. $12,000, almost a year's worth of what they managed to save, gone, more than gone. They were deep in the red, deeper than they'd ever been. He felt a helplessness so profound it sucked the air from his lungs. All his hours, all his aching muscles, all his sacrifice, for what? To still be unable to protect his own daughter when it mattered most. He had worked himself to the bone, poured every drop of his being into his craft, and it still wasn't enough. It felt like a cosmic joke played at his expense. He wasn't just tired anymore, he was broken. The following night, long after Sarah and the kids were asleep, Bo found himself sprawled on the couch, the only sound the distant hum of the old refrigerator. It was 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the world feels like it's holding its breath, and every shadow seems to deepen. He stared at the ceiling, seeing not plaster, but the cracked paint, the endless expenses, the abyss he felt they were falling into. His hands, usually so strong, so capable of coaxing life back into dead engines, now felt useless, clenching and unclenching on the worn fabric of the cushion. He dedicated his entire adult life to working hard, to fixing things, to earning an honest living. He'd always believed that if you just kept your head down and put in the hours, good things would come. But here he was, staring down the barrel of crushing debt, his family's security shattered, all despite working more hours than he thought humanly possible. He thought of Lily, pale and small in that hospital bed, and a knot of rage and despair twisted in his gut. He hadn't just felt helpless, he had been helpless. His skill, his sweat, his unwavering persistence, none of it had built a safety net. It had only built a bigger treadmill. He was a highly skilled mechanic, but he was also a fool, chasing individual jobs, one after another, like a dog chasing its own tail. Every dollar earned was a dollar directly exchanged for his own time, his own energy, his own life. If he stopped, the money stopped. If he got sick, they went hungry. If Lily got sick, well, they'd seen how that played out. This wasn't just about the money, though that was a gaping wound. It was about what his life had become. A relentless grind that offered no quarter, no peace, no real security, only the illusion of control. He was an absent father, a tired husband, a man whose hands always smelled of grease and whose mind was always calculating the next repair, the next bill. He was 42 years old, and he was no closer to escaping the perpetual struggle than he had been at 22. All those years, all that effort, had led him to this exact point. Flat on his back, staring at a leaking roof, utterly exposed and vulnerable. A profound sense of failure washed over him, not just as a provider, but as a man who had squandered his potential on mere survival. The silence of the house pressed in, amplifying the harsh, undeniable truth. The way he was doing things, it wasn't just unsustainable, it was a trap. The silence of the house pressed in, amplifying the harsh, undeniable truth. The way he was doing things, it wasn't just unsustainable, it was a trap. He didn't shout. He didn't curse the ceiling. He just pushed himself up slowly from the couch he'd drifted onto after coming back from the hospital, the old springs groaning a weary protest. He walked over to the kitchen sink, the chipped enamel reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights outside. He splashed cold water on his face, the sudden chill a jolt against his burning eyes. He stared at his reflection, a man he barely recognized anymore, haunted, hollowed out, carrying the weight of a world he couldn't seem to fix, no matter how hard his hands worked. And in that quiet, desperate moment, something inside him snapped. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating certainty of a long-held chain finally giving way. "Enough!" he whispered, the word barely audible, a ragged breath expelled into the still night. It wasn't an accusation against anyone else or even against himself, not really. It was simply a statement of fact. This wasn't living, it was just delaying the inevitable collapse. He didn't know what came next. He didn't have a plan, not a single coherent thought beyond that single, resolute word. He just knew with every fiber of his being that he would not continue this way. The treadmill had to stop. The endless chase had to end. The sun came up the next morning, indifferent to Beau's quiet revolution. The alarm still blared at 5 a.m., a brutal summons to another day of toil. For a split second, the old inertia threatened to pull him under. The familiar ache in his shoulders, the phantom smell of oil already on his hands, the mental tally of jobs waiting, it all tried to drag him back into the current. But enough! Echoed in his mind, sharp and clear. He got dressed, ate his oatmeal in silence, and kissed Sarah and the kids goodbye, just like always. But when he walked into the garage, it wasn't the same. The usual chaos of tools, parts, and half-finished projects seemed to jump out at him, a physical manifestation of his old way of thinking. Reactive, disorganized, always playing catch-up. He looked at the dusty workbench, piled high with spark plugs, wrenches, and ancient instruction manuals. He looked at the floor, perpetually littered with stray nuts and bolts, and he saw it all not as individual pieces, but as a system, or rather, the lack thereof. Usually, his first move would be to grab the clipboard with the day's first job, Mrs. Henderson's sputtering minivan, probably a quick fix, easy cash. But today, he just stood there. He picked up a wrench, a 13, and slowly placed it back in its rightful spot on the pegboard. Then another, a 10, next to it. It felt utterly wrong, almost sacrilegious, to be tidying up when paying work was waiting. Every instinct screamed at him, "Time is money, Beau. Get to work." The old fear, the one that gnawed at him about bills and Lily's medical debt, clawed at his gut. It whispered, "You're wasting precious minutes. You can't afford this." He felt a tremor of doubt, a real, physical urge to drop the wrench and dive headfirst into the minivan's engine bay. That was familiar. That was safe. But then he remembered Lily's face in the hospital bed, the fear in Sarah's eyes, the crushing helplessness that had almost broken him. He remembered the feeling of being trapped, the trap he himself had built with his relentless, unthinking labor. "No," he muttered, his voice rough. "Not today." He didn't touch a single customer vehicle that morning. Instead, he started. He found an old plastic bin and labeled it, "Used parts for disposal." He grabbed a pad of paper and started sketching out a rough flowchart for routine oil changes, thinking about how he could standardize the process, make it faster, more consistent, less dependent on him remembering every step. He spent an hour, a full, billable hour, just clearing a section of his workbench, organizing the most frequently used tools and wiping down surfaces until they gleamed, an almost meditative act. It felt like he was building a tiny, almost imperceptible foundation for something he couldn't quite see yet. Every minute felt like he was stealing from his own pocket, but every minute also felt like a quiet, defiant act of rebellion against the endless chase. The first step was taken, not towards money, but towards order. And that felt like everything. Day 3 dawned with the usual clang of the garbage truck echoing down the street, but for Beau, it felt heavier. He was still trying to keep customer vehicles out of his bay, focusing on the small, tedious tasks he'd outlined for himself. The flowchart for oil changes was taped to the wall, a simple thing, but it stared at him like a complicated schematic. Every time he picked up a rag, every time he sorted a bolt, the ghost of an idle engine, a potential dollar, seemed to sigh in the background. Mid-morning, Mrs. Henderson, a regular with an ancient Camry, called. "Beau, my check engine light is on again. Can you squeeze me in?" His gut reaction, the one honed by 20 years of survival, was to say, "Be right over, Mrs. Henderson." It was an easy diagnostic, usually a quick fix, a guaranteed $100. He pictured the bills on the kitchen counter, Lily's prescription refill sitting there, a silent accusation. But he swallowed the impulse. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm booked solid for diagnostics today. Can I put you down for tomorrow afternoon?" The words felt like sandpaper in his mouth, scratching against every fiber of his being that screamed, "No, take the money." He heard her sigh, a sound of mild inconvenience, and it felt like a betrayal. He hung up, his hand trembling slightly. That $100 was gone, vanished because he was tidying a shelf. Was this madness? By day 7, the garage was cleaner than it had been in years. Tools had homes. Used parts were neatly binned. He'd even spent an entire afternoon writing out standard operating procedures for basic maintenance, things he'd done 1,000 times on instinct, now painstakingly documented step by step. His part-time helper, Mike, a kid barely out of high school who usually just did the grunt work, looked at him with a mix of awe and suspicion. "Bo, what's gotten into you? You gonna make me read all this stuff?" Bo just grunted, pushing a grease-stained manual into Mike's hands. "Yeah, kid. You're gonna read it, and you're gonna follow it." It wasn't easy, Mike pushed back, accustomed to Bo's chaotic but effective system. "Why can't I just grab the wrench from the floor like always?" he'd gripe. Bo would have to stop, take a breath, and explain the why, something he rarely did before. He'd have to fight the urge to just snap, "Because I said so." Instead, he'd demonstrate the time saved by knowing where the 13 socket always was. It was slow, frustrating work, like trying to teach a wild dog to sit. Bo would watch Mike fumble with a checklist, take twice as long as Bo would have, and feel that familiar prickle of impatience, the deep-seated desire to just take over and get it done right now. Every minute Mike spent learning, Bo felt the clock ticking on another lost opportunity. Every time he had to correct Mike, it felt like 2 steps back. The real test came on day 14. A beat-up Ford F-150, the kind of truck that paid for a week's groceries, pulled into the driveway, sputtering and wheezing like it was on its last breath. The owner, a grizzled contractor named Frank, was frantic. "Bo, you gotta help me. This is my livelihood. If she ain't running by tomorrow, I'm losing a big job." Bo knew this truck, knew its quirks. He could hear the problem from 20 feet away, a fuel delivery issue, probably clogged injectors. A solid day's work, but a substantial payout. His old self would have been elbow-deep in the engine bay before Frank even finished talking. But he didn't. He stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, the faint smell of engine oil on his clothes a comfort and a torment. He looked at the chaos of Frank's emergency, then at the neat stack of his newly printed organized work orders on his clipboard. He thought of Lily, of Sarah, of that pit in his stomach that had spurred all this. He thought of the net. Was he building a net, or was he just chasing another fish one by one until he dropped from exhaustion? "Frank," Bo said, his voice flat, "I can't promise it by tomorrow. My schedule's set, and I'm focusing on a different kind of work right now." The words felt like a betrayal of his own hands, his own skill, his very identity as the guy who always fixed it, no matter what. Frank's face fell. He looked at Bo like he'd suddenly grown another head. "Bo, what are you talking about? You're the best. You've always helped me out." The pressure was immense. The immediate financial relief of that job, the gratitude from Frank, the validation of his skill, it was all right there, a low-hanging fruit he could almost taste. His self-sufficiency screamed at him to grab it. His fear of not providing for his family echoed louder than any system. For a long, agonizing moment, Bo almost broke. He saw himself reaching for his trusty wrench, nodding to Frank, falling back into the old, comfortable, soul-crushing rhythm. But then an image flashed in his mind. Lily, her small, pale hand reaching for his, not just for comfort, but for security, for a future he hadn't been able to give her. He remembered the dark night, the quiet promise he'd made to himself, alone in the garage. "Frank," Bo repeated, his voice now with a strange, unyielding firmness, "I can recommend you to another good shop down the road. They might be able to get to it." He gave Frank directions, watched him slowly, reluctantly back the sputtering truck out of his driveway, a cloud of disappointment in its wake. Bo stood there, alone again in the clean, quiet bay, his stomach clenched. He just turned away what could have been $1,000, maybe more. A day of hard, physical labor, yes, but a day of certain money. He felt sick, truly sick, like he'd just thrown away a lifeline. He picked up his clipboard, his hand still trembling, and stared at the empty space where Frank's repair order should have been. He defailed his old self, failed the immediate need for cash. But he hadn't failed Lily. He hadn't failed the promise. He had held the line. And for the first time in his life, he was putting the future ahead of the now. It was agonizing, brutal, and utterly terrifying. But he was still standing. He was still building. The silence after Frank's truck rumbled away was heavy, almost suffocating. Bo stood in the middle of his spotless bay, the air thick with the phantom smell of oil and regret. He'd done it. He'd consciously, deliberately turned away money. It went against every single instinct ingrained in him since childhood, every desperate scramble for a dollar. His hand still felt the ghostly heft of the wrench he hadn't picked up. A knot tightened in his stomach, a cold, hard ball of fear and uncertainty. What if this was the wrong move? What if this grand plan was just a pipe dream that would land him deeper in the hole? He spent the rest of that day, and the next, feeling like he was walking a tightrope without a net. The shop was quieter than usual, the hum of the air compressor and the distant traffic replacing the clang of tools and the murmur of conversation. He used the newfound time not to fret, but to plunge deeper into the blueprints for his new world. He outlined training modules for Mike with meticulous detail, breaking down complex diagnostics into clear, repeatable steps. He designed new, standardized inspection forms that left no stone unturned, no potential issue unaddressed. He even started sketching out a customer communication protocol, something beyond just a call when the car was ready, a system for regular updates, transparent explanations, and post-service follow-ups. Sarah noticed it first, not in the shop, but at home. He was still tired, yes, but the exhaustion was different. It wasn't the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd been chased by the clock all day. It was the focused fatigue of a man who'd been building. One evening, a little over 2 weeks after he'd sent Frank packing, he came home not just on time, but with a full 20 minutes to spare before dinner. He walked in, smelling of engine grease and something else, purpose. Lily and Ethan were playing a chaotic game of living room pirates, and instead of sighing and retreating to the couch, Bo dropped his bag, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he joined them. He was present. He was there. "You're home early," Sarah said later, her voice soft as they cleared the dinner table. There was a question in her tone, a gentle probing. The shop hadn't been as busy, she knew that. The bills hadn't magically disappeared. Bo just shrugged, a small, tired smile playing on his lips. "Had a good day, got some systems running." He didn't elaborate, but she saw it in his eyes, a flicker of something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. Then came the little victories, the tiny, almost imperceptible shifts that, when strung together, started to form a new reality. Mike, initially resistant to the endless checklists and the new, methodical way of doing things, began to surprise him. Bo had designed a step-by-step diagnostic chart for a common transmission issue, something that used to take him an hour of nuanced troubleshooting. He watched Mike, clipboard in hand, systematically work through it. 45 minutes later, Mike had identified the problem. Not guessed, not stumbled upon it, but identified it. "System works," Mike said, a rare grin spreading across his face, wiping grease from his brow. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. Bo felt a swell of pride that day, a different kind of pride than fixing a complex engine with his own 2 hands. This was the pride of creation, of empowerment. He was no longer just the skilled mechanic, the bottleneck through which all work had to flow. He was becoming a conductor. Words started to spread, slowly at first, like oil seeping into sand. "Bo's shop," people would say. "It's different now. You get a text when they start, another when they find something, another when it's done. And they explain everything." Old man Henderson, a notoriously grumpy customer who used to demand only Bo touch his truck, came in for an oil change. Bo had Mike walk him through the multi-point inspection, showing him the air filter, the tire tread depth, the brake fluid. Henderson left not just satisfied, but genuinely impressed. "That young fella knows his stuff, Bo," he grumbled, but there was a twinkle in his eye. "You're training him right." Bo started to delegate more, not out of laziness, but out of necessity and design. He set up a new digital scheduling system, trained Sarah to manage the incoming calls and appointments, giving her clearer parameters for what work they could take on and when. He spent his mornings overseeing, refining, troubleshooting the system, not the cars. In the afternoons, he might jump in for a particularly tricky diagnostic, but more often he was coaching Mike, tweaking a workflow, or even spending an hour researching new diagnostic tools or training programs. The debt was still a heavy shadow, but it felt less like an insurmountable mountain and more like a hill he was steadily climbing. He wasn't just earning money, he was creating capacity. He was building a machine that could earn money even when he wasn't personally twisting every bolt. His shoulders, which had carried the weight of the world, began to straighten. His eyes, once clouded with perpetual worry, now held a focused intensity, a quiet confidence. He still worked hard, harder in some ways because the mental effort was relentless, but the physical grind had lessened. One Tuesday afternoon, he found himself watching Mike competently explain a complex repair to a customer, walking them through the digital inspection photos Bo had implemented. The customer nodded, agreed to the work, and shook Mike's hand. Bo watched from the office, a strange sensation washing over him. It was the same feeling he'd had that night in the garage, but instead of terror, it was a burgeoning sense of peace. The money wasn't in his hand yet, but the work was getting done. The customer was happy, and Bo wasn't even in the bay. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a proprietor, a mentor, a designer. The old Bo, the man perpetually chasing the next dollar, was slowly, quietly being replaced. And this new Bo, he could breathe. That subtle shift from fear to peace grew roots, then branches. It started small. One evening, Sarah, usually the first to drift off after putting the kids to bed, found Bo not just sitting beside her, but actually listening to her day, not just waiting for his turn to talk about work. His hands, though still scarred and calloused, weren't clenched tight in his lap. His shoulders, she noticed, seemed to have eased down from his ears. He looked tired, yes, but not utterly spent. He looked present. "You're different," she ventured one night as he meticulously organized a new batch of digital inspection forms on his old laptop, the screen glow casting shadows on his face. He paused, a rare, thoughtful smile playing on his lips. "Just trying to build something that lasts, hun, something that earns its keep, even when I'm not wearing myself thin trying to make every single buck." He looked at the screen, then at her. "More than just fixing cars. Fixing how we live." The change wasn't just at home. At the garage, the rhythm had fundamentally altered. Bo wasn't frantically bouncing between three bays, wrench in hand, sweat dripping. Instead, he was orchestrating. He'd be observing Mike's technique, offering a quiet adjustment to his diagnostic flow, or showing the new kid, Ricky, how to properly document a repair. He spent mornings reviewing inventory, afternoons researching specialty tools that could cut job times, and evenings refining the customer service process, building automated reminders and follow-ups that kept the bays full. The systems he was creating were like invisible gears, interlocking, humming quietly in the background, making the whole enterprise turn smoother, faster, more profitably. There was a Thursday, almost 3 months after Lily's surgery, that solidified it for him. He had an unexpected meeting with the bank about a small business line of credit, something he'd always avoided, preferring cash in hand. He hesitated, then did something he never would have dreamed of a year ago. He left Mike in charge. "You got this, Mike. Call if you need anything, but don't call unless it's absolutely critical." He said it with a confidence that surprised even himself. Stepping out of the garage, the sun on his face felt different. Not just a brief respite, but a conscious decision. He spent an hour at the bank, then another hour at a supplier, negotiating better bulk rates. When he returned, Mike was calmly finishing up a break job, Ricky was tidying the shop, and a new customer was waiting patiently at the counter. No chaos, no emergency calls, just work flowing. He walked into his small, cluttered office, the weight of the debt still present, but now a manageable burden, not a suffocating blanket. He could see the path out. The garage, once a place of endless, individual battles against broken machines and dwindling daylight, was becoming a fortress of efficiency. It wasn't about him doing all the work anymore. It was about the work itself, moving through well-oiled channels. Months passed. The clutter in the rental house still spilled from the garage, but now it was often new tools, parts for a home improvement project, or even a modest, slightly worn but still functional ping-pong table for Lily and Ethan in the driveway. The emergency medical debt that had crushed him was steadily shrinking. Then finally, mercifully, it was gone. Replaced not by new debt, but by a slowly growing reserve. He even managed to put a down payment on a small, worn-out commercial property down the road, a second location he'd been eyeing. He was still Bo, the mechanic. But he wasn't just a mechanic. He was Bo, the man who owned the garage, the man who built the systems, the man who trained the next generation of mechanics. His hands still knew every torque setting, every engine knock, but his mind was on flowcharts and spreadsheets, on training modules and growth strategies. He still got dirty, but it was often from inspecting a new piece of equipment, not from chasing the last bolt on a late-night repair. One evening, watching Lily and Ethan play, the sun setting orange and purple across the modest backyard, he turned to Sarah. "You know, I used to think more hours just meant more money. Turns out it just meant more tired." He paused, a deep breath filling his chest. "The real trick ain't just catching fish, it's building a better net. Once you got the net, the fish just come to you and you can actually go home and see your kids." He hadn't chased money, he'd chased a better way. And in that pursuit, he'd found not just wealth, but